you're right. In the new book, Your Child in School, I do talk more about it. I have said some things about it in the past in Creative Schools. I remember saying Creative Schools, I went to a meeting in LA a few years back of alternative education. And there are all kinds of different groups and organizations which are kind of grouped under this heading, alternative education. And what they have in common is that their strategies and approaches are customized to the students, the individual students, as opposed to students having to adapt to the program. They look at individual students and say, what would work with you? What are your interests? And even if they're working on ideas which they may not initially find interesting, how can we get you interested in this? How can we engage you? What's your skill set? What sort of, what are your attitudes? What are you bringing to the table? So they have the students' capacities and interests and personalities at the heart of the strategies. They're flexible and diverse and various in the way they tackle things. They recognize the importance of teachers and mentors and give them proper support, and they're often close links with the community. So they're very personalized, very customized, very diverse, and they work for the most part. And I mean, it's like alternative medicine. Some aspects of it work, some don't. But people tend to think of alternative medicine as something that's loosely based on kale. And the fact is that alternative medicine is something which also reaches deep into conventional medicine. There are plenty of people I've spoken a lot at medical conferences of late and to medical practitioners about the need to humanize medicine. And there are plenty of people in the mainstream profession who are deeply critical of the data-driven, impersonal, rather mechanistic approaches to the diagnosis and treatment of people with a whole variety of illnesses. And the failure of doctors often in the way they're trained these days to recognize that the people they're dealing with are human beings with complex feelings and physiologies which are interrelated, and that people recover best when you look in their eyes and understand really what's going on with them. And that this isn't only a question of looking at a computer screen while the patient sits aside, swathed in electrodes. You have to speak to the person and get to know what their condition is and what their existential state is, as well as the physical symptoms they're describing. People are seeing big results when they think differently like that. So it isn't just about people using unusual herbs and buying odd crystals and thinking that's alternative medicine. I'm not being disparaging of any of that, by the way. I'm just saying that there isn't a strict demarcation. And I'm saying in education too, there have been plenty of people for generations who have been practicing in public education systems the sorts of techniques and applying the sorts of principles that these days we would label under the heading of alternative education. It isn't like there's a strict border between these two sorts of activities. In fact, on the contrary, a lot of my work has been trying to get some of these more learner-centered principles spread into the mainstream of public education. But there are plenty of people there who are doing it already, but who are doing it in spite of the dominant political culture in education, not because of it. But it's always interested me that these practices, which are customized, personalized, humanized, often have tremendous success. And it's just interesting that this is called alternative education. I mean, if education were like this, then as a whole, there'd be no need for the alternative. But there have always been, I suppose the bottom line is that since the mid-19th century, for the most part, countries have evolved mass systems of public education. There weren't many before then. And these systems grew up in the context of industrialism and often in the interests of industrialism. And you can see it in two ways. One is that the organizational culture of schools is highly reminiscent, indeed often modeled on the principles of industrial production. That's to say, schools are organized and national systems are organized on principles of supply and demand, It's why, for example, in the 1960s, there were very few university places compared to now, because not so many people were required to have degrees because the industrial economy didn't require that. There was a greater need for manual work and for technical work. As the knowledge economy has grown, so higher education has expanded, because the recognition is now that more people will be doing what's often thought of as intellectual work rather than manual work. So suddenly the floodgates have been thrown open into higher education. Actually, floodgates open out, don't they? The gates have been thrown open into higher education. And this isn't because there's been some remarkable improvement in the intellectual capabilities of recent generations, so they're now all able to benefit from universities, whereas the boomers were not capable. It's that there's a need for people educated to a higher level, a greater need than there was. So it's always been, it's like turning a spigot on, it's always about supply and demand. So that's one. It's linear. And you see that especially in the way schools are organized, and with testing. You get through this gate, you get through that gate, you get through that gate, and eventually you get to the doors of higher education. If you make the grade, you get in. It's industrial in the sense too that it's focused on a particular type of product, the academic graduate. The system's not designed to produce dancers, musicians, trombonists, and street performers. That's not what it's for. It's to produce people who can go and get a university degree, and there are other routes, people who can't make that cut, which are of lower status. And like most industrial systems, it produces a huge amount of waste. People who don't make it, and then we don't know what to do with them. Dropouts, kids who don't graduate on time, people who get put into remedial programs, people who are seen as somehow the kind of detritus of the system. And all of these are choices that have been made in the way the system is being put together. And it's why they work for some people, and they do work very well for some people. They're designed to work for those people. And they work less well for lots of other people. And even, by the way, for the people they do work well for, these days they're starting to fail them because of the sheer amount of stress that's being generated in the system to keep up with it. Huge amounts of emotional turmoil, of depression being generated by the system. And I often say this to politicians, who ask me about it. They say, we have all these problems of non-graduation. We have stress in schools. We have high rates of teacher turnover. We have higher levels of dissatisfaction among employers these days. How can we solve these problems in education? And I'm not being facetious when I say stop causing them. That would help. Don't do it. These problems are caused by the system, and if the system were to change, then it's like we're looking around at all these problems of cardiovascular disease and obesity. How can we solve these problems? Stop generating this toxic diet that's being driven by malpractices in agriculture, and the kind of ultimate irony of the capitalist system here. That we are killing the very people who are buying these products through the products we're creating for them. We are creating this is not a problem that has arisen from nowhere, by some malign universe. We are doing this, so we could stop doing this if we chose to. And I don't want to overcall it, but I'm saying that the education systems were designed with particular purpose in mind. They evolved. I don't believe already in there being a kind of single conspiratorial view. There have been key people in the histories of education in our different countries, different cultures, who've been deeply influential on the course they've taken. But eventually it enters the cultural bloodstream, and people just think that's what education is. That's how it works. And it doesn't have to work that way. That's the point. And what I say in Your Child in School is that there's a difference between learning, education, and school. Kids love to learn. We are rapacious learners. Look at your kids now, speaking French fluently. Why? Because you immerse them in French culture. They got excited by the whole idea. And you didn't have to sit there, presumably, and go through irregular verbs with them. They'll just pick it up. We've got a grandchild. I'm not going to sit her down and start teaching the subjunctive. She'll figure it out. Kids love to learn. Learning is the natural process of acquiring new skills and understanding. Education is an organized approach to learning, a more intentional system of learning. And a school is a community of learners. That's what the original academy was. It's a community of learners, people who come together to learn with and from each other. kids love to learn. They don't all get on with education, and some have a very bad time at school. And the problem isn't kids or learning, it's school. It's the way we do school. And so alternative education is a whole collection, a whole community of institutions who are, and people and projects, initiatives, who are rethinking how we can do school in a way which is consistent with and nurturing of the natural conditions and natural impulse to learn. And if you can keep the flame of curiosity alive in children, the one they're born with, if you keep kindling that, they'll just keep learning. It's what drives learning, the curiosity to find out about yourself and the world around you. And it's a great achievement of public school systems that we managed to snuff that out in so many kids. You know, and it's not there. We blow it out because we create conditions in schools which teachers don't want either, for the most part, by the way. It's a systemic issue. We create conditions in school which suck the oxygen out of the room. And you can see kids just getting lifeless. And so, you know, in the worst case, we start to medicate them and say, you know, just pay attention. And I'm with the kids, and we'll make it interesting, you know, and it will. And this isn't, you know, this isn't an unprovable theory, and there's no one way to do it. I mean, I went to a brilliantly good academic school. There are some brilliantly good academic. I'm not saying that's not the point. It's about balance. But the school I went to, you know, it was deficient in other areas. I mean, there should have been better arts programs, and then we had to make that happen. There isn't just the one way to. It's like there's no one great way to be a rock band. There's no one great way to be to have a restaurant. There's no one great way to decorate your house. There's no one great way to create a garden. There are principles on which we know people are more likely to flourish than not. And among the ones I see are in school, in our education systems, that there should be a greater emphasis on diversity, because people are highly diverse in our talents and our interests and dispositions. They should be more creative in the sense they are capable of generating new forms of ideas, new ways of thinking, and they should be non-linear. We should recognize that life isn't a straight line.